I think it's time for the May King to finally make his appearance. So let's jump straight into the legend of the heroic outlaw that stole from the rich and gave to the poor, Robin Hood. But is the Robin Hood from Fate Extra the same one from all the ballads and folklore? You see, there have been many recorded instances throughout history involving the literary figure known as Robin Hood. There's Robert Hood, who put on the alias Hob Hod to become an outlaw after having all his money confiscated from him. There's Roger Godbird, another outlaw whose recorded career seems to have been quite similar to that of Robin Hood's. Then there's all the bandits and thieves who used Robhod as an alias or surname that signified their outlaw status. Either way, the identity of Robin Hood has yet to be attached to a single person in history. So you may be wondering, where does Fate Extra's Robin Hood fit into all this? Our man in green is just one of the many incarnations that Robin Hood could take. Just like in history, his legend didn't belong to a single person. It was more of a heroic mantle that was passed down to those willing to bear it, all stemming from the supposed original who was a thief from the mythical Sherwood Forest of Nottingham in the 12th century. A man who was known for opposing the tyrannical rule of the temporary King of England, John Lackland. So then, is the Robin Hood we see in Fate Extra this man? Not quite. Although he is based off of his legend, Fate Extra's Robin Hood has his own story, and it goes something like this. There once lived a young child, an orphan, who was taken in by a wandering druid. This druid taught him many things, including the ways of how to survive in the forest. It may be because of this, or his affinity with the forest, or even his druid father, that this orphan was able to see the fairies that lived there and interact with them. But the other people of the village could not, and as such, they treated him like an outcast. So after his druid father had passed away, he lived at the outskirts of the village, far from where they could bother him, and he could bother them. But he always managed to stay within arm's reach, just in case something happened. You see, at the time, the area was governed by a tyrannical feudal lord, and his village wasn't receiving the best of treatment from him. But regardless of how these villagers treated this orphan in the past, his sense of justice wouldn't allow him to just abandon these people. He became what the village needed, and probably what they wanted too. A vigilante with clothes of green and a bow made from yew. He had made his first appearance a grand one, and successfully resisted the feudal lord's army. It was after this that he became known across the village as the mythical Green Man. So the man who was once outcast by his own village had set aside his very identity and become a hero for the greater good. But as such, his life became one filled with conflict. Day in and day out, he would lay traps and prepare for the next battle that was sure to come. Though as he fought to protect these villagers, the villagers themselves began to have a change of heart. They decided to take advantage of the Lord's focused anger so that they could lighten the blame from themselves. After all, the only reason Robin Hood existed was to protect them. But if they were to deny this fact and outcast Robin Hood, play him off as some random rogue with no association to anything or anyone, then maybe the Lord would be more lenient towards them. Just as Robin Hood had been outcast as a child, he was now outcast again as a hero by the very people he was trying to protect. Even so, Robin Hood continued to fight for this village. They eventually branded him as a coward for constantly using cheap tricks like poison and forest traps to assassinate enemy soldiers. But what could he do? It was only him fighting a whole army. The pride of being an honorable warrior meant absolutely nothing to him so long as the village was safe. Eventually, after not even a couple of years, Robin Hood had fallen prey to the enemy soldier's assassination plot. And even after being caught, no one knew who he was. This man who always fought in the shadows for the greater good died as he had lived. As a man without an identity, without anyone to remember his name or his adventures, or even his just motives. He was just a rogue hunter that liked to stir up trouble in the forest. That's all he'll ever be remembered as. Or so he may have thought before he died. But the Moon Cell knew his just intentions, and that's what grants him the status of heroic spirit, and allows him to be summoned as the incarnation of Robin Hood in this Moon Holy Grail lore. Which now brings us to his abilities and noble phantasms. As you'd expect, his weapon is the yew bow, the bow of prayer. This also classifies as his noble phantasm. Not only is it your typical crossbow that shoots poison arrows, it also has the ability to amplify poison or make a disease more potent. It essentially can control any impurities that are around it, even if the target hadn't been hit by a poison arrow. So for example, say a servant had just fought Semiramis and lived, but was infected by her poison. If this servant then came across Robin Hood, he could make the poison that's already infected the servant that much more powerful and defeat that servant without even having to fight. The bow also has the ability to materialize roots from the forest in which it was crafted. If given enough time, it could reproduce the entire Sherwood Forest, And while in the Shorewood Forest, he can manipulate areas to be already infected with poison by shooting an arrow at it. As long as an arrow makes contact with something, the poison will transfer to the target and begin to spread. But while using this bow, Robin Hood can't use his other noble phantasm, and that's No-Face May-King, Faceless King. This is his green clothes, and it's basically Harry Potter's Cloak of Invisibility, but on steroids. When worn, the clothes erase the entirety of the wearer's physical presence. No noise, no smell, and of course, they completely blend in with the surroundings. It can't, however, hide magical energy. This noble phantasm stems from more than just the fact that he hid his identity with green clothes as Robin Hood. It's because the May King represents Robin Hood, the man whose identity remained hidden forever, otherwise known as the Transparent King, a man who is considered to be the very incarnation of nature. So the Faceless King is a very useful, supportive noble phantasm, but when it comes to combat, all he really has is his bow. In terms of skills, he has Protection of the Fairies, which is just an RNG booster that grants more luck, and there's also Independent Action, which allows him to be a self-sustaining servant, one that doesn't need a master supply of mana to survive. So even if his master was to die, he would still remain materialized for almost a week before he would start to disappear. And that's Fate Extra's Archer, the Faceless King Robin Hood. It was a short episode today, but a classic one. It's not too often that we come across some well-known historical figures like Robin Hood, but now that he's done, it's time to move on to the next one. So be sure to vote in the community poll with which servant you'd like covered next week. Ish. Oh, and if you're wondering when the next Overlord video is, that will be out in the next few days. But as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So until next time, ciao!